I'm Lindsay. I'm one of the pastors here at Wesley. I've met a few of you here for the first time here with seniors and visitors, so it's so good to see all of you here today. Thank you, seniors, for being here and for being here over the past years. Thank you for the seniors who have had a part in the leadership of this service. And I just want to mention that the girl in the pink dress, her name is Lindsay, and she is, I think, is in 8th grade and 7th grade. And I don't know if y'all caught this, but a 7th grader was singing a blessing upon all of these seniors. And that is what we are about. That was the most beautiful thing that I have experienced in a long time, that a 7th grader is praying a blessing over you. This is the impact that you have made, seniors, on even people younger than you. And so all ages are coming together in worship and in support and in prayer for one another. That was just a beautiful thing and a beautiful example of what it means to be around the table. So this is the second week. We are smack dab in the middle of a series called The Table. So that's why we have a table out here. And so we've also kind of carried on this theme song, The Crowded Table. I got it. Somebody emailed me this past week and said, thank you for that song. I've listened to it all week long. And so have no fear. We'll hear it again next week as well. So next week, Greg is going to be preaching, and we are going to be talking about, it'll be Mother's Day, but we'll also be talking about how we are gathered around the table for communion. And so we'll have communion next Sunday. I know you might have been ready for it because it was the first Sunday of the month, but have no fear. We'll do it next week, and we'll talk about the Lord's table and how we gather around the Lord's table as well in Holy Communion. But today, we're going to talk about a dinner party. This is found in Luke chapter 14, verses 12 through 24. Luke chapter 14, verses 12 through 24. Then Jesus said to the person who had invited him, "When you host a lunch or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or rich neighbors. If you do, they will invite you in return, and that will be your reward. Instead, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, crippled, lame, and blind, and you will be blessed because they can't repay you. Instead, you will be repaid when the just are resurrected." When one of the dinner guests heard Jesus' remarks, he said to Jesus, "Happy are those who will feast in God's kingdom." Jesus replied, "A certain man hosted a large dinner and invited many people. When it was time for the dinner to begin, he sent his servant to tell the invited guests, 'Come, the dinner is now ready.' And one by one, they began to make excuses. The first one told him, 'I bought a farm and I must go see to it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I bought 5 teams of oxen and I've got to go check on them. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I got married, so I just can't come.' When he returned, the servant reported these excuses to his master. The master of the house became angry and said to his servant, 'Go quickly to the city streets, the busy ones and the side streets, and bring the poor, the crippled, and the blind, and the lame.' The servant said, 'Master, your instructions have been followed, and there is still room.' The master said to the servant, 'Go to the highways and the back alleys and urge people to come so that my house will be filled. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will taste my dinner.'" Let's pray together. Oh Lord, we thank you for the invitation. We thank you that there is this table. We can just picture it in our head, this table that people get invited to, and they're welcome there, but yet there is still room at the table for more and more. Lord, let us hear that invitation. Let us join in that invitation. Amen. Something some of us don't always love about the idea of a table We like the food aspect and we like the gathering aspect, unless you're like an extreme introvert, and then you might not like the gathering aspect. But some things we don't always love is the concept of table manners. So growing up, you might have had a lot of people tell you about table manners. Some of you are currently growing up and you hear about table manners all the time. Some of you are the ones that get to remind people over and over about table manners. There are some table manners reminders that I have to give as a mom that I never thought that I would. Never. And I have to give them over and over and over. Don't lean on the table. Keep your food on your plate. All kinds of things that we have to remind one another. Don't kick your sister. Don't make that loud screechy sound. All of the things that could go wrong at a table, we have to remind them over and over. So, I often tell people that I don't believe that the Bible is a list of rights and wrongs. I don't really think that the Bible is something that you open and you have a list of things that you're supposed to do, and you have a list of things that you're not supposed to do. And so when you wonder, should I do this thing or should I not do this thing? It'd be like a list of table manners that you can just go to and find out what to do and what not to do. Yeah, it tells you some things and gives us some guidance, but in general, overall, Jesus has a different idea for how we're supposed to navigate our lives. It's kind of a hard concept to grasp because life would be a lot easier if we had this list. Oh, let me see. Am I about to throw food or say, "Ooh, this food's disgusting. I'm not going to eat it." Let me look on this list of manners and find out if that is one of the good manners or not. Life would be a lot easier if that were the case. But I believe that abundant life with Jesus, life in the Spirit, means that we will see fruit if we are connected. That the good stuff will shine forth and the bad stuff will be pruned away. So Jesus gives us some table manners, of course, like a list of what not to do at the table: throw food, bang your fork on your plate until somebody tells you to stop, like a drum. And then we go back to how we get to the table in the first place. Jesus says, let's hit the rewind button a little bit. Instead of worrying about these nitpicky things, let's talk about how we get to the table in the first place and how we get others to the table and what we do when we get there. So this morning is all about the ideas of invitation and welcome. Invitation and welcome. And these things, we are actually talking as a staff this past week. And we talked about the idea that invitation and welcome go hand in hand. You can't invite somebody to something without then upholding your end of the deal by welcoming them once they get there. What if I were to invite somebody to the table and say, hey, come have dinner with me, and then don't speak to them the entire dinner? Or make them serve their own food. And then at the same time, you can't welcome somebody if you haven't invited them. You can't just assume that people know that they are invited. So let's first talk about that invitation. Remember back in January when I gave out star words? Some of you were here and we had the first Sunday after the new year. I gave out these little cards. And if you're like, oh, that sounds cool. Hey, it's only May. If you want a star word, I'll give you one later. Just ask me. But I got a star word, and I'm not saying Star Wars. Some people thought I was saying Star Wars. Star words. I got a star word, and wouldn't you know, my star word was invite. And how interesting that me as a pastor here got the word invite. Because I always believe that I could invite this whole town to church, and that would be great. But the people that are going to be the ones to invite others to church and for it to be sustainable and for it to be a thing that multiplies disciples is if you, the church, invites others to church. To be able to be a witness to your faith and say, look, this is what God has done in my life. And this is what I'm inviting you to do as well. So I want you to be a part of it and to be a witness to that. So I've pondered a lot of things about the word invite and what that means to me. And here's what I've pondered is sometimes we assume that people know that they're invited. We do what they do here, when they had the dinner party and they said, hey, just bring in guests. And I'm pretty sure they just issued a blanket, y'all come, everyone's invited. They might have done like a Facebook event and waited for people to hit the going and not the interested button. And that's fine, but that's not the type of invitation we're talking about here. It's super easy to give out a blanket invitation, but are we really inviting somebody to the table? Are we specifically approaching somebody and saying, there is a place for you here? Calling somebody by name, just like Jesus calls us by name and says, there is a place for you here. Jesus spent a lot of time here in this section of Luke talking about what it looks like when we're invited and what it looks like when others are invited. My favorite part of the story is that the servant is told to go to the highways and the back alleys and continue to invite dinner guests because we have got to fill up those seats because there is still room at the table and we want to make it a crowded table. It certainly wasn't convenient, but it took effort for them to go and invite others. And it was people that aren't typically invited to the table. It's as if Jesus is saying, out of all the people, I choose you. I want you to be a part of this table. So we, through the love of Jesus, have the opportunity to look at someone in the eyes and say, out of all the people, I choose you. And this right here at this crowded table is your spot. And what are we being invitational about, by the way? As with all of the parables, we can take this lesson and apply it to our lives. And this parable can help us shift our mindset. Not specifically a list of things to do, rights and wrongs, but shift our mindset so that we are invitational. So how can we take on that invitational, intentional nature of Jesus? Maybe it is going to the sick and the poor and inviting them to a life of fullness and richness. The other day, I have a friend that is running this social media page for her. She's getting her doctorate in ministry. And so she has this social media page where she posts images of Jesus and what that means to us and what those images of Jesus kind of conjure up in our culture and in our lives. And she posted the fact that somebody put there was a $100 million campaign to put these big billboards in Times Square, New York, about Jesus and about the character of Jesus. And one of the slides that would scroll through in Times Square was something about how Jesus welcomed the poor. And her discussion prompt was, what does this mean and how do we feel about the fact that it took $100 million to tell people to welcome the poor? And could we welcome the poor with the $100 million that they used to spend on those billboards? It's just something to ponder. What does it mean to welcome the poor? And so what does it mean when we are invitational? Well, it could mean to go to the poor and the sick. It could mean that we invite somebody to worship. It could mean that you invite somebody to the next small group Bible study that you're a part of. It could mean that you meet somebody to go for a walk and just talk about life with. It could mean that you invite somebody out to coffee. And maybe your conversation over coffee isn't about anything specific, but it was the invitation, the fact that somebody was looked at in the eyes and said, I choose you. I want to be a part of this with you. Maybe you simply invite a person who you barely know to share their story with you. Give them the opportunity to be a witness. And that invitation for you to take interest in their lives and for them to share their life with you goes a long way. Maybe you invite someone to pray for you, to pray with you. In the last service, we were serving communion, and we were short a communion server. And so I did what every good pastor does. I went over to somebody and I said, "Can you serve communion?" It turns out that it was a huge blessing to her, because as you know, we haven't been doing communion in the way that we usually do communion. And she said she had served communion in the past and had missed it so much. And it was a blessing for her to be able to serve communion to the congregation. And that was an invitation. I looked at her in the eyes and I said, I'm inviting you to be a part of that. What does it mean for you to be invitational? Once you invite, you've got to be ready to welcome. So many times in the church world, we say, hey, my church is welcoming. Often, we say, my church is welcoming, my church is friendly, because we ourselves feel welcome. But can we stop and think about how others might feel? Somebody who has never been here before, walking into these doors for the very first time. It's good to consider, are we really welcome? Around 15 years ago, a United Methodist bishop named Robert Schnees wrote a book called The 5 Practices of a Fruitful Congregations. And this book was all the rage for a minute. Every church was reading it because they too wanted to be a fruitful congregation. And so it listed, of course, 5 practices. And the thing about the book is I will confess, I don't remember all 5 practices. But I do remember the first one, because I think I will never forget the first one. The concept of it has stuck with me for all these years. He called it radical hospitality. And radical hospitality is completely different than regular old hospitality, where you just stand there and say hi, and then you maybe have a pitcher of tea sitting there. Radical hospitality is completely different. He says, Christian hospitality refers to the active desire to invite, welcome, receive, and care for those who are strangers, so that they can find a spiritual home. So yes, that applies to life here at Wesley Church, but we want people to find a spiritual home wherever it is that we are and that they are. Because the church exists here within these walls, but it also lives and thrives outside of these walls as well. In order to have your hospitality be radical, you must change behaviors in order to accommodate newcomers. When I was a pastor at a church in Kennesaw, we had this really great evangelism committee. They were wonderful. They did great things out in the community. And they thought, where can we go to reach others with the good news? Where can we just simply love on people? And so they decided that they were going to have a hot dog party at a local trailer park. And so when they did that, there was one that was pretty close to the church, about maybe a mile away. And they they set up this hot dog party with games and with food, and it was just just to welcome and say hi, be invitational, be friendly, just to bring some cheer to that community. And so I went out there and we had a lot of fun. We met a lot of people. But wouldn't you know, that next Sunday, a family from that community came to church. They were a little different than the rest of the people at the church, just by the way they looked, just by the way that they lived. They kind of stood out. And people would look at me and say, what do we do with them? People did not know what to do when they went out and they were invitational and their invite worked. And then it was their turn to be welcoming. And they were ready to change what they did in order to make this family feel welcome. They didn't have a car. They walked the mile from that neighborhood to the church with a stroller. There were 3 small children, and we had always, a little food time, kind of like the biscuit area, but people would bring food, and that was their breakfast, that was their lunch, might have been even their dinner that they took with them on their way out. So what was a simple hospitality, welcome to church kind of food situation, that was their meal for the day. And so they did church a little bit differently, and so we had to adapt. So when you invite, you got to be ready to welcome, to follow up with that. When I was at LaGrange College, I was involved in the leadership at Wesley Foundation. Any of y'all seniors going to LaGrange College? Didn't think so. It was wishful thinking. It's kind of a small school. It was a very small school. In fact, that we called the dining hall the calf. And so we would have these kind of competitions between tables. We all knew each other, but then they all sat in groups. Like one fraternity sat over here, and the baseball team sat over here because they were basically their own fraternity. And then all the drama people, and then all the religion majors sat together. And then we kind of mixed and mingled a little bit, but we all knew each other. And so sometimes we'd we combine tables sometimes, try and see who'd make the biggest table. And then we would do this competition where we would try and see whose table was the funnest. And so somebody would throw out this random punchline that had nothing to do with anything. And then we all erupt into laughter because we wanted to be the funnest table. It was kind of a competitive dining hall. But we wanted to see how many would fit into one table. You might be here today because somebody invited you. And hopefully this crowded table that there's still room for, hopefully you know that there's a place for you here and that we are the fun table. I was at the funeral of a beloved church member this past week, and somebody came into the door. And as soon as they came into the door, they found me, and they said, "This man who we celebrated the life of, he is the reason that I come to church today." Somebody invited you at some point. And so I hope that you can invite somebody else. Seniors, I think it's safe to say that all of you are here today because somebody brought you, or because you came and somebody welcomed you. Somebody said, "There's a place for you here. Hey, look, I saved you a spot at this table." You're not just here as a warm body to add to the number. When Jesus was looking for those party guests, he was saying, "It has to be you. You are the one I'm looking for." Now is the time of year, seniors, that everybody is going to be giving you some special wise advice. Have you heard it already, little snippets? You might have even put some wise advice in your yearbook. In my yearbook, I didn't know what wise advice, they have little quotes from the seniors. So there was an 80s movie I really loved called Better Off Dead, and there was a quote in there that says, "Go that way really fast, and if something gets in your way, turn." So that was my quote. I wanted to leave an impression. That was my wise advice, and it is pretty good advice in life in general. If something gets in your way, turn. But my advice for you today, if you can handle one more piece of wise advice, as you make this big life transition from this point into the next, remember that you are welcomed in. You have been welcomed in. You are welcomed in now. There might be times that you might have wished that you were a little more welcomed than you were, and that's okay. But you know that at God's table, there is always a place for you. Do not let anyone or anything tell you there is not a place for you at God's table. Whatever you do, whoever you are, there's always a place. And remember that there is always a place for others at God's table. So when you're feeling a little awkward about this new phase in life, you can remember Lindsay singing a blessing upon you and all of the ones that are holding you up as you have gone from that place to this place and this place to the next. You remember that somebody else is feeling a little awkward about things too. You're not alone. So why don't we all start with an invitation and a welcome?